January 17, 1943, Tunisia, dawn. The desert wind carried sand across the Kasserine Pass like whispered warnings no one would hear. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley, his Afrika Korps goggles darkened with dust, his hands gripping a worn pair of Zeiss binoculars. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon, but already the heat began to rise from the earth in shimmering waves. Below him, German and Italian forces prepared defensive positions, digging, fortifying, awaiting the inevitable clash with the Americans who had landed in North Africa only 2 months prior. Rommel lowered the binoculars. In his leather-bound field journal, he made a notation in precise script: "The Americans are green, but one man concerns me, Patton." He underlined the name twice. For 3 weeks, Rommel had been studying American movements, reading intercepted communications, analyzing the enemy's tactical shifts in the Western theater. And for 3 weeks, he had been sending the same message up the chain of command to Berlin, to Rome, to every high officer within reach: watch Patton. He is not like the others. But in those early months of 1943, when German forces still believed in their invincibility, when the specter of Stalingrad had not yet shattered the myth of Teutonic supremacy, Rommel's warnings fell on deaf ears. His fellow generals dismissed them as the paranoia of a tired commander, the anxieties of a man too long in the desert sun. They would learn, but by then it would be too late. The story of Erwin Rommel's warnings about George S. Patton is not merely a tale of military foresight ignored. It is a study in hubris, in the fatal cost of underestimating an enemy, and in the collision of two philosophies of war, one rooted in centuries of Prussian discipline, the other forged in the reckless, violent sprawl of the American frontier. To understand why Rommel's alarm was dismissed, one must first understand the context in which it was raised. The winter of 1943, when Germany's Wehrmacht still held the illusion of dominance, and the Americans were seen not as warriors but as amateurs playing at a game they did not comprehend. Operation Torch, launched in November 1942, had brought American forces ashore in Morocco and Algeria. It was their first major engagement in the European theater, and by all German assessments, they were woefully unprepared. Reports from the front described American units breaking under pressure, retreating in disarray, led by cautious, hesitant commanders who prioritized safety over aggression. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, was viewed by German intelligence as a politician in uniform, a man better suited to negotiating conferences than commanding armies. The British, battle-hardened from 3 years of war, carried the real weight of the Allied effort. The Americans, Berlin believed, were little more than logistical support wrapped in bravado. But Rommel had been in North Africa since 1941. He knew this desert. He understood how it tested men, how it stripped away pretense and revealed the core of a commander's character. And in the chaos of early 1943, as American forces stumbled through their baptism of fire, Rommel saw something his peers did not. He saw a pattern, a subtle, dangerous shift in American operations whenever a particular name appeared in the intelligence briefs. Major General George S. Patton, Jr. Patton had arrived in North Africa in early March 1943, tasked with taking command of the battered WWII Corps after the humiliation at Kasserine Pass. That defeat inflicted by Rommel's own forces had been swift and brutal. American troops had fled, leaving behind equipment, vehicles, and entire supply depots. It was Germany's finest moment in the African campaign, a validation of every assumption about American weakness, but Rommel did not celebrate. He studied the aftermath with the cold eye of a predator, and what he saw troubled him. The Americans had broken, yes, but they had not collapsed. They regrouped, they learned, and now a new commander was coming, a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm front. George Patton was not a typical American officer. Born into Virginia aristocracy, raised on tales of Confederate valor and frontier conquest, he embodied a peculiar American contradiction. Aristocrat who worshipped violence, an intellectual who craved combat, poet who wrote in blood. He had studied war since childhood, reading Caesar and Napoleon, memorizing cavalry charges from the Napoleonic Wars, drilling himself in the languages of battle as other men studied scripture. By 1943, he was 57 years old, a man out of time, a throwback to an age when warfare was personal and brutal and glory still meant something. Rommel had read Patton's service record. He knew of the man's exploits in World War I, his command of the 1st American Tank Brigade, his obsession with speed and aggression, but more than facts. Rommel sensed something in the way Patton commanded, a recklessness, a fury that defied the textbook strategies of European warfare. Patton did not fight to hold ground, he fought to destroy. And in the unforgiving vastness of the North African desert, where supply lines stretched thin and movement was survival, that kind of commander was dangerous. On March 6, 1943, Patton took command of II Corps. Within days, the transformation was visible. Soldiers who had grown lax under previous leadership now stood at attention, uniforms pressed, helmets polished. Patton enforced discipline with an iron hand, levying fines for missing neckties, for unshined boots, for any infraction that suggested softness. He believed that soldiers who looked like warriors would fight like warriors, that pride in appearance bred pride in performance. To his men, he was both tyrant and inspiration. To Rommel, monitoring these changes through intelligence reports, it was a confirmation. Rommel penned another message. Patton is imposing order. He will attack soon. We must prepare. The message went to General Hans-Eugen von Arnim, commander of the 5th Panzer Army. It went to Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, supreme commander of Axis forces in the Mediterranean. It went to Berlin. The responses were dismissive. Von Arnim scoffed at the notion that one man could change the character of an entire corps. Kesselring, focused on the broader strategic picture, saw no reason to divert resources based on Rommel's instincts. And Berlin, preoccupied with the Eastern Front and the disaster unfolding at Stalingrad, had little patience for warnings about a single American general. Rommel persisted. On March 15, he wrote again, "Patton's movements indicate an offensive within the week. His forces are probing our flanks with unprecedented aggression. This is not reconnaissance. This is preparation." Patton struck on March 17, 1943. The target was the town of El Getter, a strategic crossroads in central Tunisia. The assault was swift, coordinated, relentless. American infantry advanced under cover of artillery, supported by tanks and air support. But what stunned the German defenders was not the firepower, it was the speed. Patton had drilled his commanders on rapid movement, on exploiting breakthroughs, on never allowing the enemy a moment to regroup. His forces punched through the initial defenses, seized the high ground, and held it against German counterattacks that came in waves. For the first time in the North African campaign, American forces did not retreat. They held, and then they pushed forward. Rommel, observing from his headquarters, felt a grim satisfaction. He had been right, but there was no triumph in it, only the cold recognition that his warnings had been ignored and now his forces would pay the price. He dispatched urgent orders to von Arnim. Patton must be stopped. Commit reserves immediately. Von Arnim hesitated. The reserves were needed elsewhere, he argued. The British were applying pressure in the north. Resources were stretched thin. To commit everything against the Americans seemed an overreaction. Rommel's response was curt. "You do not understand. Patton is not Montgomery. He will not wait. He will not consolidate. He will attack until we break." But the reserves were not committed, and Patton did not wait. By late March, American forces under Patton's command had seized key positions across southern Tunisia. The victories were tactical, not strategic, small gains in a larger war, but their impact was psychological. For the first time, German soldiers faced Americans who fought with the same ferocity, the same relentless pressure that they themselves had once wielded. Captured prisoners spoke of Patton with a mixture of fear and respect, describing a commander who seemed to be everywhere at once, driving his men forward, tolerating no hesitation, no excuse. Rommel compiled these reports, adding them to his growing dossier on Patton. He noted the American general's use of armor, his preference for flanking maneuvers, his willingness to take risks that more cautious commanders would avoid. In one intercepted radio transmission, Patton had barked at a subordinate, "I don't want you to hold, I want you to attack, always attack." Rommel underlined the phrase in red ink. It was not doctrine, it was instinct. And instinct, Rommel knew, was the most dangerous weapon of all. He wrote to Kesselring one final time, "Patton is not simply a competent commander, he is a revolutionary force. His philosophy is American in its essence: speed, aggression, abundance. He does not fight to preserve, he fights to consume. If we do not adapt, we will lose." Kesselring's reply was terse. "Focus on your sector, Herr Feldmarschall. Leave strategic concerns to those in command." Rommel closed the letter. He did not respond. There was nothing left to say. To understand why Rommel's peers dismissed his warnings, one must grasp the ideology that underpinned German military thought in 1943. The Wehrmacht was built on a foundation of Prussian military tradition, a philosophy that valued discipline, precision, and the supremacy of the professional officer class. Wars were won through superior tactics, through the flawless execution of complex plans, through the mastery of logistics and terrain. The German soldier was trained to be a cog in a perfect machine, and the German officer was trained to operate that machine with cold efficiency. This mindset had served Germany well in the early years of the war. Blitzkrieg lightning war was the ultimate expression of this philosophy, rapid, coordinated strikes that overwhelmed the enemy before they could respond. It had worked in Poland and France in the opening months of the Russian campaign, but by 1943, the machine was breaking down. The war had become a grinding, attritional struggle on multiple fronts, and the Germans were learning that perfection could not be sustained indefinitely. Patton represented something fundamentally alien to this worldview. He was not a product of military academies or centuries of aristocratic tradition. He was in many ways self-made, a man who had studied war on his own terms, who had forged his own philosophy from a combination of classical texts and frontier brutality. He believed in speed over precision, in audacity over caution, in the power of the individual will to shape outcomes. He did not command his forces like a conductor leading an orchestra. He commanded like a cavalry officer leading a charge, personally, viscerally, with an almost religious fervor. This approach was quintessentially American. It reflected a nation that had been forged in violence, that had expanded across a continent through sheer force of will, that believed progress came not from tradition but from disruption. And it terrified Rommel because he recognized that this was a kind of warfare Germany was not prepared to fight. The Wehrmacht could counter strategy. It could adapt to tactics. But how did one counter a commander who thrived on chaos, who turned disorder into opportunity, who seemed to gain strength from the very unpredictability that paralyzed more methodical minds? Rommel's symbolic object, the one constant he returned to in his analysis of Patton, was the American tank, not the Sherman itself, which was technically inferior to German armor, but what the Sherman represented: abundance. American factories could produce tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Patton's forces rolled forward on a tide of steel and gasoline that seemed limitless, inexhaustible. German panzer divisions, by contrast, fought with machines that were masterpieces of engineering, Tigers, Panthers, vehicles superior in firepower and armor, but there were so few of them. Every loss was irreplaceable. Rommel understood this asymmetry. He had seen it firsthand, watching American supply convoys roll across the desert, carrying food, ammunition, fuel in quantities that would have seemed obscene to his own troops. German soldiers subsisted on rations that grew smaller each month. American soldiers ate hot meals, drank coffee, smoked cigarettes as if the war were a temporary inconvenience. It was not merely a difference in resources, it was a difference in philosophy. America waged war as an industrial process, a problem to be solved through sheer volume of output. Germany waged war as an art form, a test of skill and will. Patton thrived in this environment of abundance. He demanded speed, and the American supply chain provided the fuel to sustain it. He demanded firepower, and American factories delivered. He lost tanks, and more arrived within days. To Rommel, this was not just a tactical challenge, it was an existential one. How did one defeat an enemy who could afford to fail, who could absorb losses that would cripple any other army and still keep coming? April 1943, the Battle of El Guetar entered its final phase. Patton's forces had driven the Germans from the high ground, seized the crossroads, and now pressed toward the coastal cities. Rommel, his health deteriorating, his forces depleted, prepared to withdraw, but even in retreat he continued to study his adversary. He noted how Patton's pursuit was relentless, how the Americans gave no quarter, no opportunity to regroup. It was not the behavior of a cautious commander seeking to minimize casualties. It was the behavior of a man who believed that momentum, once gained, must never be surrendered. In late April, Rommel was recalled to Germany. His time in Africa was over. He left behind a theater in collapse, his warnings unheeded, his predictions validated too late. On the flight back to Berlin, he wrote a final entry in his field journal. "The Americans have found their champion in Patton. We had the opportunity to prepare. We chose to ignore it. History will not forgive that mistake." The German High Command continued to dismiss Rommel's assessments even after his departure. Von Arnim, now in sole command, insisted that the American success was temporary, a fluke born of numerical superiority rather than tactical brilliance. Kesselring echoed this view in his reports to Berlin. The Americans, they argued, were still amateurs. They had won battles, yes, but battles were not wars. But the soldiers in the field knew differently. They had faced Patton's armor, had been driven from positions they thought secure, had watched American foe Arsaes exploit every hesitation, every moment of doubt. In the barracks, in the trenches, in the whispered conversations between exhausted men, Patton's name carried a weight that no official report could diminish. He was the American Rommel, a commander who fought with instinct and fury, who seemed to anticipate every move, who never stopped attacking. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa were in full retreat. Patton's II Corps, alongside British and French units, pushed toward Tunis and Bizerte. The campaign that had begun with American humiliation at Kasserine now ended in triumph. On May 13, the last German and Italian forces in North Africa surrendered. Over 250,000 Axis troops were taken prisoner, a loss comparable to Stalingrad, a catastrophe that Berlin could not ignore. Patton did not celebrate. He was already looking ahead, planning the invasion of Sicily, refining his tactics, preparing for the next fight. But for the Germans who had survived North Africa, the memory of those final months would linger. They had entered the campaign confident in their superiority, dismissive of the American threat. They left it broken, prisoners of an enemy they had underestimated, haunted by the knowledge that their commanders had ignored the one man who had seen the truth. Rommel, recovering in Germany, received the news of the surrender with grim resignation. He had warned them. He had told them Patton was different, that the Americans were not the soft, hesitant force Berlin imagined, but pride and ideology had blinded his peers. They had clung to the belief that German military excellence was inherent, unshakable, that no amount of American resources or industrial might could compensate for lack of tradition and discipline. Patton had proven them wrong, and in doing so he had not simply won battles, he had shattered a myth. The relationship between Rommel and Patton, though they never met in person, was one of mutual respect filtered through the lens of war. Rommel recognized in Patton a kindred spirit, a man who lived for combat, who saw war not as a duty but as a calling. In his private writings, Rommel speculated on what might have happened if he and Patton had faced each other under different circumstances, in a different war. He believed they would have understood one another, two relics of an older, more personal form of warfare, trapped in a conflict that had become industrial and impersonal. Patton, for his part, admired Rommel's tactical genius. He studied the German generals' campaigns in France and North Africa, incorporated Rommel's principles of mobile warfare into his own doctrine. But where Rommel fought with the elegance of a chess master, Patton fought with the brutality of a brawler. He did not seek to outthink his opponents. He sought to overwhelm them, to break their will through sheer relentless pressure. It was a difference in style, but also in philosophy. Rommel believed in the supremacy of the professional soldier. Patton believed in the supremacy of the warrior spirit, raw, undisciplined, terrifying in its intensity. The American system allowed for this kind of commander. The German system did not, and that perhaps was the deeper truth Rommel had tried to convey in his warnings. The Germans fought as a collective, a unified machine. The Americans fought as individuals unleashed, each commander empowered to interpret orders, to adapt, to take risks. It was messy. It was chaotic, but in the hands of a man like Patton, it was devastating. June 1943, Sicily. Patton commanded the U.S. 7th Army in the invasion, racing across the island in a brutal competition with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The rivalry between the two Allied commanders was public, bitter, a clash of egos that Eisenhower struggled to contain. But it was also instructive. Montgomery fought with caution, meticulous planning, a determination to avoid unnecessary casualties. Patton fought with speed, accepting losses as the price of momentum, driving his forces forward even when logic suggested consolidation. In Berlin, analysts studied the Sicily campaign with growing alarm. Patton's name appeared in every report, his forces always at the tip of the spear, always pushing faster than seemed possible. The warnings Rommel had issued months earlier were now validated beyond question. But it was too late. The Americans were no longer the uncertain, hesitant force that had landed in North Africa. They had been forged in the desert, tempered by combat, transformed by commanders like Patton into an army that could match the Wehrmacht blow for blow. Rommel, reassigned to the Western Front, prepared for the inevitable. He knew the Americans would come to France, he knew Patton would lead them, and he knew that this time there would be no margin for error, no opportunity to withdraw and regroup. The next battle would be for Europe itself. He wrote in his journal one last observation about his American Cown. Terpart, Patton does not fight for ideology or empire, he fights because he must, because it is his nature. In another age he would have been a barbarian king. In this age he is the herald of a new kind of warfare, one where the individual will, backed by industrial might, can reshape the world. We have no answer for this. We can only hope to delay the inevitable. The epilogue of Rommel's warnings is written in the battles that followed. Normandy, the breakout from the hedgerows, the race across France. In every engagement, Patton's Third Army moved with a speed that defied German predictions, exploiting gaps, encircling defenders, turning retreats into routes. The Wehrmacht, battered and depleted, fought with the same discipline and professionalism that had defined it since its inception. But discipline could not counter abundance. Professionalism could not counter fury. By the winter of 1944, Rommel was dead, forced to take poison after being implicated in the plot to assassinate Hitler. He did not live to see the final collapse of the Reich, did not witness the American and Soviet armies meeting at the Elbe, did not see Patton's forces driving deep into Germany itself. But his warnings, dismissed and ignored in 1943, had been vindicated. The generals who had scoffed at his concerns about one American commander now faced the consequences of that arrogance. Patton, for his part, fought until the war's end, always pushing forward, always attacking, never content to rest. He believed that hesitation was death, that the only way to win was to never stop moving. It was a philosophy forged in the American frontier, in the belief that progress came through conquest, that greatness was seized rather than inherited. And in the crucible of World War II, that philosophy proved more resilient than centuries of Prussian tradition. There is a photograph taken in the spring of 1945 of an American soldier standing beside a captured German tank. The tank is a Tiger, one of the finest pieces of military engineering ever produced, a masterpiece of design and firepower. But it is out of fuel, abandoned by its crew, a relic of a war that prized quality over quantity. The American soldier leans against it, smoking a cigarette, surrounded by crates of supplies that stretch to the horizon. The image captures the essence of what Rommel had tried to warn his peers about, the collision of two worlds, one built on excellence and tradition, the other on abundance and momentum. Patton understood this. He did not romanticize war, did not pretend it was anything other than brutal and ugly. but he knew how to harness American strengths, the factories, the resources, the reckless confidence of a nation that believed it could solve any problem through sheer force of will. And he knew that in modern war, those strengths mattered more than elegance or tradition. Rommel had seen this truth in the deserts of North Africa. He had tried to share it, to warn his fellow officers that the old rules no longer applied, that a new kind of commander was emerging, one who thrived in chaos, who turned abundance into a weapon, who could not be defeated by superior tactics alone. But pride and ideology had deafened those who needed to hear. The cost of that deafness was measured in the ruins of Berlin, in the millions of lives lost, in the collapse of an empire that had believed itself invincible. And at the center of it all, unacknowledged by history but recognized by those who fought, was a warning ignored, a field marshal who saw the future and a general who embodied it, locked in a war where only one philosophy could survive. The desert wind still blows across the Kasserine Pass, carrying sand over positions long abandoned, over battlefields where armies clashed and empires fell. If one listens closely, standing on that rocky outcrop where Rommel once stood, one might hear the echo of a warning that no one heeded, a voice crying out across the distance, urging caution, demanding attention, insisting that the world had changed and that change could not be ignored. But warnings are only as valuable as the willingness to heed them. And in the spring of 1943, surrounded by the illusion of invincibility, the German High Command chose pride over prudence, tradition over adaptation. They dismissed Erwin Rommel's alarm about George S. Patton as the paranoia of a tired commander. By the time they understood their mistake, the Americans were no longer at the gates. They were inside, unstoppable, led by a man who embodied everything Rommel had warned them about: speed, aggression, abundance, and an unshakable belief that victory came to those who never stopped attacking. That is the lesson written in the dust of North Africa, inscribed in the ruins of Europe, whispered in the wind that carries the memory of battles long past. It is a lesson about hubris and humility, about the cost of underestimating those we dismiss, about the danger of clinging to old certainties in a world that has already moved on. Rommel tried to warn them, they ignored it, and history, indifferent to pride and tradition, rolled forward on the treads of American tanks, carried by the fury of a general who would not be denied, unstoppable as the desert wind itself.